You're listening to 97.3 KJJI Tropico FM. I'm Luke Mayville, and this is Reclaim Radio Hour. Reclaim Radio Hour is a statewide community conversation about how we, the people of Idaho, can make government work for all of us, not just the wealthy and the well-connected. On the program today, we'll be joined by May Roberts, Policy Analyst at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. We'll air an interview with May that we recently recorded where we talk about the decisions of Idaho's elected officials to give away huge tax cuts that have mostly benefited the wealthy. We get into the real-life impact of those tax cuts for Idaho's working families. I'm joined today by my co-host, Samya Saran. Samya, when most people think about taxation and these issues of taxes and revenue, they don't immediately think, whoa, that's an exciting issue that I really want to talk about. But I got to say, when you and I sat down recently for an interview with May Roberts, it was fascinating, and I think we both really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, May is so knowledgeable. May is so passionate about what they are doing. And I think that really comes through in the interview. I also think that taxes, a lot of us, when we talk about taxes or hear about taxes, we kind of groan a little bit. But the truth is taxes affect every single one of us. We're either paying taxes or we are benefiting from public goods and services that are only possible because of taxes. So everyone has an opinion on them. Everyone interacts with them. So I'm really excited to talk more about them today.
Well, just hearing you, I'm reminded of that old quote that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. And thinking about this interview with May, we talk a lot about how, if you care about public education, if you care about the quality of our schools, the quality of our health care, whether kids have a chance to, pursue a higher education, whether we have decent roads where we're not running into a pothole every 5 seconds, all these things have a whole lot to do with tax policy and whether we have decent tax policy. I think another big thing, and I'd be interested to just get your thoughts on this. And Samya, by the way, I know that you're a graduate of political economy, something
Yes.
you studied in college. There's this whole other element of this discussion, which is justice and what some people call tax justice, which really gets at, who benefits from our tax policy and who pays the cost.
Yeah. One of the reasons our elected officials have so much power over us is because they, for a lot of us, take a portion of our income and decide what to do with the distribution of that money. Ideally, hopefully, that distribution would be just on both ends, both in terms of who is paying taxes and how much they're paying, and also who is benefiting from them. And one of the things that I was really interested to learn from May Roberts is that there are certain groups of people who seem to, there are certain groups of people who benefit both ends more than others, and there are certain groups of people who are not as lifted up by those policies as maybe they could be. And I think it's really interesting to learn about who those groups are because it might surprise us.
Well, one of the things that makes me think back on the last several years, watching all of these big tax cuts go through the Idaho legislature, and then also watching them at the federal level over and over again. And hearing, I remember always hearing something that really made me mad, which is, we would learn that these tax policies mainly benefit the wealthy. And then legislators would respond by saying, well, that's not an issue because it's only the wealthy who pay taxes. Like, they pay most of the taxes, so of course they're going to benefit. And that really made me mad because I remember learning, especially from groups like the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, which is, we're going to hear from May Roberts, who's a policy analyst with that organization. I remember learning from them about who really pays taxes, including in Idaho, where they used to pass around this screenshot that it would be all over social media. I think the first time I saw it was maybe like 8 years ago, where they just laid out this simple graph and they actually showed that the lowest income people pay a greater percentage of their income in taxes than the highest income people. And maybe some people out there would say, how could that be? Well, it ends up being because sales taxes and property taxes and all these other ways that lower income people pay taxes. A lot of the time that just isn't something that gets accounted for, even though it's such a burden for people out there in their everyday lives.
Yeah. No, I think in Idaho specifically, we, when I think about tax cuts, I think specifically about private school vouchers. And also, something that really surprised me was grocery tax and how grocery tax exemptions would end up affecting the people of Idaho maybe a little bit differently than anticipated.
Well,
Is there
I think,
anything?
Samya, I think you're pointing to some future episodes of Reclaim Radio Hour where we could dig in even more on those issues. And certainly before long, we'll do an episode completely dedicated to this problem of private school vouchers, which so many people out there are really worried about what impact that's going to have. But I think you're right. I think private school vouchers are a tax policy. It's a type of tax policy that really benefits wealthier Idahoans, because as we know right now in Idaho, there's no limit. You can make $1 million a year and still get public funds to send your kids to a private school. So we'll hold off on that for another episode. But what do you think, Samya? Should we jump into our interview with May Roberts?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's hear what she's got to say.
Okay, well, if you're just tuning in now, you're listening to 97.3 KJJI Tropico FM. I'm Luke Mayville here with Samya Sarin. This is Reclaim Radio Hour. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to hear some music. When we come back, we'll be joined by May Roberts from the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. Stay with us. You're tuned in to 97.3 KJJI Tropico FM, and this is Reclaim Radio Hour. I'm Luke Mayville here with Samya Sarin. We're happy to welcome to the show May Roberts, policy analyst at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. May, I just want to jump right into a big picture question that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be interested in. Why do these issues of taxation and revenue matter so much to you? And why should they matter to our listeners?
Yeah, great question. So I think that when people hear tax policy, they automatically just think it's all about numbers and spreadsheets. But to me, it is really about people. I think tax policy is people policy. It's about whether our kids have good schools, whether families can get through hard times, whether our communities have all the resources that they need. So that's really what drew me into the work. I grew up here in Nampa, and when I was 15, my dad took me on a trip to Haiti after that devastating earthquake in 2010. It was quite the experience. He was volunteering in a medical clinic, and I spent my time helping at the local orphanage, and it completely changed the way I looked at the world. I met children whose families had to pay to send them to school if they could afford it at all. And clean water was only accessible through a couple wells. So the things that I had always taken for granted, like being able to go to public school, having good roads to drive on, and just basic things like having a park to go play at, just weren't there. So that experience made me realize that strong communities really don't happen by accident. They require strong investment in a government that really works for the people and invests in them. And then later on, I worked as a case manager for people that were needing to access services like Medicaid and SNAP, which is the food assistance program. And I met a lot of really hardworking people that were just dealing with difficult times and needed to provide for their families. And something that just struck me through that work was, if this is so difficult for me to sort out, like as a case manager for them, how are people doing this all on their own? And that's how I realized I wanted to work further upstream, instead of helping one family at a time, really shape the policies that affect all Idaho families. And working in local government reinforced that and made me realize that legislators are citizen lawmakers. They really want to make good decisions, and they rely on accurate information from the public and nonprofit experts, experts in the field, local businesses. And so joining the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy 4 years ago, everything really came together for me in that way, to help provide nonpartisan research for lawmakers, to help them understand how tax and budget policy works and affects people's everyday lives, and how tax policy is making sure that we have the resources we need to provide those critical services for our people. So it's not just about the spreadsheets, even though I love the spreadsheets. It's about the choices that we make as a state, making sure that we have strong schools, safe roads, healthy communities, and all that doesn't happen on their own. They really require that thoughtful investment. So that's why I care so deeply, and I think that tax policy should really matter to your listeners.
May, I'm so excited to talk with you because I find the issue of taxes to be really, really interesting. Most people, if not almost all people, pay taxes.
Yes.
So it really is a form of interaction with our government that we all have at least some experience with, and everyone seems to have an opinion on it.
Mm-hmm.
My next question is, if we look back over the last 4 or 5 years, can you just give us an overview of the tax cut decisions in the Idaho legislature? Tell us a little bit about what happened, and maybe who was impacted by those decisions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So over the last 5 years, Idaho lawmakers have made a series of income tax cut decisions. So since 2021, the state tax cuts have resulted in about $1.3 billion annually in tax relief for Idahoans. And then combined with federal tax changes since 2018, Idaho households are receiving about $4.5 billion annually in federal income tax cuts. And on the surface, that sounds like, okay, great, like $4.5 billion in tax relief. But what I've really learned in the work is that every tax decision is also a budget decision. So it does have a budget impact as well that impacts Idaho families. So the real questions to ask is who benefits from those changes? And then how do we continue funding the public services that Idaho families rely on? So one big thing that we've looked at is that those benefits weren't evenly shared in that $4.5 billion in tax relief. So there's kind of two pieces here. One is that Idaho's tax system has become less balanced. So sales and property taxes take up a larger share of income for lower and middle income families than they do for wealthier households. So in the past, Idaho had a graduated income tax prior to 2021 that kind of would balance out that impact, and it offsetted some of that difference. And then when we moved to a flat income tax, it just kind of compounded onto that and made our system less balanced, with higher income families getting more benefit from these tax cut decisions than low income families. And so you can really see that in the numbers and in a lot of our reports. Most recently, we shared that combined state and federal income tax cuts resulted in 73% of the benefits going to the top 20% of income earners. And then And like just looking at it in dollar amounts, that's about $111,000 a year in tax cut benefits for the highest income, the top 1%, and then $1,300 for middle income families, and then actually an tax increase of $96 for those with the lowest incomes. And that's because alongside these broad-based income tax cut decisions, were also some decisions to remove some tax credits that were targeted towards low-income families, like the enhanced premium tax credit that helped families afford healthcare, then their health insurance on the exchange, and the state child tax credit going away. This next time everybody files their April tax returns, they'll notice that that is no longer there unless lawmakers take action in January to restore it. So those trade-offs are already beginning to show. Like I said, tax policies decisions are budget decisions. So the past legislative session, lawmakers adopted across the board budget cuts because revenue growth had slowed, largely due to tax cuts at the state and federal level. And so we're really seeing how those, budget cuts are really affecting Idaho families.
Those are some crazy statistics. I know that the numbers can be hard to conceptualize, but it's just so crazy. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the upcoming legislative session now. What does all of this mean for the upcoming legislative session, and how can our listeners out there get engaged and stay engaged?
Definitely. So going into this legislative session, I think that we're beginning to see the consequences of some of those choices that I was just talking about. Idaho, it's a good thing that Idaho is currently not in a financial crisis anymore. We ended the year with a positive cash balance. You might have seen in the news, $250 million getting carried forward into the next fiscal year. So the state did keep a balanced budget, but due to those budget cut decisions. And at the same time, though, we're hearing that we're in a good fiscal place, but that does not mean that our budget is going to be restored for fiscal year 2028. State leaders have made it really clear that we're entering another really tight budget year. Agencies were instructed to submit maintenance only or like bare bones budget requests and to use supplemental requests for their budgets as a last resort, and asking for new funding only if it's absolutely necessary. So that's really a signal like that we're shifting away from what further investments can we make to, make Idaho stronger, into what can we afford to postpone for right now to kind of pick up the bill later on down the road. So how I like to think about those kinds of decisions is like maintenance on your car. So like if you're trying to save money, you might choose to forgo an oil change, but it increases the chance that you're going to be paying for a really big maintenance bill down the road, a really expensive repair that might come up. And so public investments work the same way. So when we're delaying maintaining roads or replacing aging school buildings, investing in behavioral health, those needs don't disappear. They usually become more expensive to address in the future. So some of the trade-offs that we're seeing, like with families right away, we're seeing some of the costs shifted to them. So I believe it was fall last year, we were seeing that there were reductions to services for children with disabilities. And those children still need support. Just because the support from the state goes away doesn't necessarily mean that the families can forego those treatments for their children. So they have to either pay more out of pocket to provide it themselves, or simply go without services. And so we're seeing how some of those costs are being shifted onto families. And we've seen it in public education as well. When the K-12 budget wasn't increased this year, it was held whole, so it wasn't cut. But there's a lot of still inflationary costs, like maintenance costs, teachers' health insurance premiums are still going up, and that's a cost that needs to be addressed. And so we see more supplemental levies on the ballot. Schools asking to increase property taxes to help pay for those costs. We're seeing those costs, shift to property taxpayers, make up the difference there. And then colleges and universities were hit really hard with those budget cuts as well. And we saw the Department of Education approve tuition and fee increases. So when taxes are cut and then budgets are cut, those costs don't just go away. They're shifted onto local governments and communities and families. So yeah, that's why these budget conversations are really important. It's just, I try to just make it clear that these choices that we're making today are going to shape the kind of Idaho that we live in tomorrow. Just really going into next session, we're going to be paying attention to what kind of those funding priorities end up being. I think the governor had a press release about what he'd like to see the priorities go towards. So we're going to keep an eye on that and see if there's any talk about, renewing the child tax credit. And we'll just continue to educate lawmakers and the citizens of Idaho as well. And what I really want to encourage people with is that our lawmakers are citizen lawmakers. They do really want to hear from the people that they represent. So it's just really important to stay informed, ask questions, and then share your experiences if you've experienced any of these things from these budget cuts with your lawmakers, and let them know what services and programs that are really important to you and that you want to protect. And you can always stay informed with us. We have a newsletter at idahofiscal.org. And we have webinars during the legislative session as well. So yeah, my goal is really to help Idahoans understand these issues so they can participate in the conversation and have all the facts that they need when they talk to their representatives.
Well, thank you, May, so much for that, for ending with a call to action, because we always want to know how people out there can get more engaged. I'm going to ask a final question. This is something we want to start doing regularly with our interviews on Reclaim Radio Hour. And I'm not just springing this on you. We talked about it a little bit in advance. But if you could leave our listeners with a quote that has inspired you in some way.
Yes. So there's a quote from the Lorax from Dr. Seuss, and it's always really stuck with me. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. So we all need to come together to advocate for the services and the people and everything that really matters to us. So we need to come together to make a difference.
Thank you so much, May. I don't think we're going to improve on that. And everyone should go watch the Lorax. Everyone should go. Also the original book is the real classic, right? But
oh yeah, for sure.
Check that out. And everyone should check out Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy and all the good work that May and others are doing over there. Thank you so much, May. Everyone, you've been listening to Reclaim Radio Hour on 97.3 KJJI Tropico FM. We're going to take a quick music break, and when we come back, we'll be turning to some listener questions. Stay with us, everyone. You're listening to 97.3 KJJI Tropico FM. I'm Luke Mayville, and this is Reclaim Radio Hour, a statewide community conversation about what we, the people of Idaho, can do to make government work for all of us, not just the wealthy and the well-connected. I'm joined in the studio by my co-host, Samya Sarin. We're going to end the hour by taking some listener questions. Samya, can you pull up some of the questions submitted by our listeners?
Our first question is from Vicky in Kuna. What was the last year that Idaho's tax policy worked for all of its citizens, and why was that?
Well, that's a good question. I think the most important time to point back to is the 1990s. Because in the 90s, we had much higher tax rates for the highest income earners and corporations, including large corporations in Idaho. And since the 90s, those tax rates have gone way down. So, for example, the tax rate on corporations used to be 8%. It's gone all the way down to 5.3%. the tax rate on the highest earners used to be 8.2%. That's gone down to 5.3. And just to put that in perspective, because maybe these all seem like kind of small numbers, when you go from an 8% tax rate on corporations down to 5.3, that's over a third of the taxes that you used to pay that you're no longer paying. And that's hundreds of millions of dollars that could have gone towards things like public schools, different, types of healthcare programs, roads, bridges, all kinds of services for the people of Idaho. So those income tax rates on corporations have gone way down since the 1990s. And meanwhile, the tax exemptions that lower income people used to get for their property taxes have gone way down in value. And that's another topic that we might address on a different episode. But we have a property tax exemption that was actually passed by a ballot initiative back in the 1980s. And the value of that exemption has not gone up with inflation. So every year that it stays the same, that value for lower income property owners shrinks. On top of all of that, one of the most burdensome taxes that lower income people pay is the sales tax. Nearly everything you buy, and that tax rate has actually gone up over the years. So if you go all the way back to the 60s, it was down around 3%, and now it's 6%. So doubled what it was back then. So over the last several decades, but especially since the 1990s, we've seen the tax code become much more lopsided in favor of high earners and large corporations, and really more burdensome for working families.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought up all of these examples, because I think sometimes when we talk about money and we talk about these kind of abstract numbers and figures, it can be hard for us to conceptualize of how much of a difference these percentile points can make. But even when we're just talking about sales tax, 3% versus 6%, as a consumer, I immediately feel how much of a difference that makes in terms of what I'm paying. And then I can only imagine what a difference that would make in terms of the services I could potentially be benefiting from, in terms of all the examples you gave, the public schools and the roads, etc. So thank you for that. Our next question is from Zena in Moscow. When did working families last hear from the legislators that their taxes will go down because wealthy taxpayers are paying their fair share in Idaho?
Well, if you're looking for a recent example of Idaho, here in Idaho, of taxes becoming a lot fairer, you'd be looking for a long time, and it'd be really hard to find an example of that. It's mostly gone in the other direction. But I do want to give one example at the federal level, and this did impact Idaho. At the federal level, back in 2010, when the Affordable Care Act passed, the big healthcare law, there was something in the Affordable Care Act called the net investment income tax, and that was an extra 3.8% federal tax on certain types of investment income for wealthier Americans. And the important thing about that new tax on, high earners investment income, the money that was raised through that tax went to fund a program called Medicaid expansion. And Idaho then adopted Medicaid expansion through a ballot initiative, which we talked a lot about on our last episode of Reclaim Radio Hour. And the benefits from Medicaid expansion go directly to working families. A lot of the people who are struggling the most in the current economy are getting their health care through Medicaid expansion. And it's very equitable because people all across the state, as long as you're in the right income level. And so that is at least an example. Again, it didn't happen because of a decision by the Idaho legislature. It happened because of a combination of federal decisions and Idahoans at the grassroots level putting Medicaid expansion on the ballot. But that was a clear example of a little bit of an increase in taxes for the highest earners, and then benefiting directly some of our most, the working families out there who are most in need of a break. In this case, giving them health care.
Our last question is from Dean Jones in Valley County. In the last 2 years, I've had almost $2,000 in tires and front-end repairs due to the potholes on Highway 55, which I drive frequently. This is an unintended tax on me, and I'm certain I'm not alone with front-end repairs due to the state's failure to maintain state highways.
Thanks so much, Dean, for that comment. I think you're making it real. We're talking a lot about the facts and figures, but this really does come down to things like potholes that end up, with expensive trips to the mechanic and expensive, front end car repairs, as you mentioned. And there's a bigger point here, which also really came out in our, interview with May, which is that when we don't fund public services that really benefit everyday people, that's essentially a reduction in income for people, because it's a cost in their, that they have to calculate in their basic cost of living, and that applies to everything from potholes to healthcare to housing to education. And I did think of one old saying, and this is from Idaho's Governor Cecil Andrus, who was a 4-term governor whose final term was in the early 90s. He used to say that our public lands, he would refer to our public lands and he called them our second paycheck, referring to these publicly provided, publicly protected lands that we have access to in Idaho as basically a form of income that actually makes our life better. And I think you could say the same about any number of public services, whether we're talking about the environment or whether we're talking about schools or roads or bridges or healthcare. So thanks again for that question, Dean. Well, folks, that's going to be it for today's episode. Thank you so much to Tropico FM for hosting Reclaim Radio Hour. Thank you to all of our listeners out there. If you have a question you'd like us to answer on the air, you can get in touch with us by going to reclaimidaho.org, signing up for our email newsletter. You can also find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. You've been listening to Reclaim Radio Hour on 97.3 KJJI Tropico FM. We'll be here live on the first Wednesday of every month at 2 p.m. You can also tune into our podcast and find us on YouTube and Spotify. Till next time, be well, everyone.